You are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Felon. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Earlier this year, I taught a course for the yearly Heritage Life Skills Workshop entitled Getting Ready, Not Arrested, Gun Laws for Preppers. In fact, I will be teaching that course again this coming April. Now, I opened the class by saying, "Welcome to the Sunday morning meeting of Felons Anonymous. My name is Paul, and I'm a felon." My point, of course, is that if you own a gun, and certainly if you have the temerity to carry a gun for self-protection, you are almost certainly an accidental felon, having broken any number of thousands of arcane and often unknown state and federal gun laws that are on the books. The recent prosecution of an Ohio man for making minor modifications to one of the extremely popular AR-15 style pistols now on the market points out how easy it is to run afoul of ATF regulations. By accidentally creating what the BATFE considers a highly restricted NFA weapon, regulated by the National Firearms Act of 1934. Now, we should note that violation of the NFA is a federal felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And worse, one of the things the ATF prosecuted him for was a restriction not even known to the general public. Indeed, there are almost certainly thousands of otherwise law-abiding citizens walking around today who have made themselves accidental felons by making seemingly benign additions to their firearms. So as a service to law-abiding owners, our show today will feature Virginia attorney John Pierce, who routinely advises clients on how to remain within federal gun laws and who runs an excellent site I suggest you check out at johnpierceesq.com. Pierce being P-I-E-R-C-E. So John Pierce ESQ, as in Esquire, johnpierceesq.com. Now, I ran across the site while conducting research for an earlier episode of the show and recognized John's name as someone I had potentially known years ago when I wrote gun rights for Examiner.com. Sure enough, it was the same John Pierce, and I'm happy to say he agreed to be on today's show to help you from becoming an accidental felon. But first, this just in on the gun news front. Last night, you might have gone to sleep in North Carolina, but believe it or not, you woke up in Florida, in Broward County to be exact. Remember how we sent a good conservative to Congress in the election that was held more than a month ago, namely Mark Harris, who won the 9th Congressional District race, an open seat, and won it by a scant 905 votes. Well, bad news. Just like in Florida and Georgia, the leftists are now trying to steal this seat too. In fact, the North Carolina State Board of Elections has now twice refused to certify the results of the election, citing what they claim are irregularities. Now, at the forefront of this effort to unseat an elected Republican is, of course, the Charlotte Observer and its parent company, McClatchy Newspapers, which is breathlessly running full-page articles in that effort. As you may be aware, Harrison is a true pro-gun conservative who has promised to sponsor pro-gun legislation and to join the Freedom Coalition, which is chaired by Congressman and patriot Mark Meadows of the 11th Congressional District in western North Carolina. That, of course, places Harris high on the leftist hit list. At issue, they say, are absentee ballots turned in for, of course, the Republican candidate Mark Harris. Even the Charlotte Observer admits that, and I quote, collecting and delivering applications for absentee ballots isn't illegal. But the volume of absentee ballots, says the Observer, was, and I quote, too high. Translated, that means that the get out the vote effort for Harris was too effective. Can't have a Republican doing anything effective, now can we? Indeed, one of the cases of supposed malfeasance cited by the Observer and its parent company, McClatchy Newspapers, which, by the way, also owns the Raleigh News and Observer and the Durham Herald Sun, they cited a woman who said her ballot was collected by a friend of the family, which I believe is perfectly legal. Another instance cited by McClatchy involved receiving 1,000 voter registration applications from people already registered to vote, which to me suggests an effort to ask Republicans, are you registered to vote? Oh, you're not sure? Well, let's submit another one to be on the safe side. Again, perfectly legal. There is apparently one unsavory character on the fringes of the investigation, one Leslie McCrae Dowless, by the way, not to be confused with Dallas Woodhouse, this is Dowless, who apparently paid a couple of women to harvest ballots. That's absentee ballots. But ignoring for a moment that nobody has yet determined how many ballots Dowless harvested, saying only that he collected 590 applications for ballots, not ballots themselves, what we see here is the application of a game called Some Say, as in, some say, you club baby seals for sport. That's a game in which the speaker casts aspersions on the accused without actually citing any evidence for the accusation. The Observer plays Some Say against Harris by saying, without citing evidence, that Harris hired Dowless, who in fact may have been working for another consulting firm. So Harris did not directly hire Dowless. The head of the State Board of Elections has already resigned amid accusations of partisan maneuvering. But perhaps richest of all was the claim by State Board of Elections Vice Chair, and also Democrat, Joshua Malcolm, citing voting irregularities, claiming the decision not to certify was not, and I quote, not a Democrat or a Republican decision. What he conveniently ignores saying is that the irregularities occurred in Bladen County, which has 12,543 registered Democrats, but only 4,131 registered Republicans, and Robeson County, which has 48,762 registered Democrats, but only 9,730 registered Republicans, meaning that in the counties of suspected fraud, Democrats outnumber Republicans by as much as 5-1. And through all of this, of course, local and national media alike are claiming for a do-over, a new election so they can install Dan McCready, who, parroting other anti-Trump Democrats, has already refused to say whether he would support an effort to impeach Donald Trump into Congress. And here are some of the headlines. Alleged fraud clouds North Carolina's 9th District vote. Possibility of a new election is raised, celebrates the Charlotte Observer. Or a new election might be the only way forward in North Carolina, breathlessly announces New York Magazine. New York. They have a large concern about a North Carolina election, apparently. Now, here is the thing. Our Gun Rights Political Action Committee, the GRNC Political Victory Fund, was largely responsible for Harris's primary election win against incumbent and rhino Robert Pittenger, and played a role through thousands of robocalls, emails, and online ads in Harris's general election victory. But we spent everything we had on the elections. If they succeed in requiring a new election, which is looking increasingly likely, we don't have the resources to fight that battle again. So, folks, I'm asking you to help us prevent the left from stealing this congressional seat, regardless of where you live in the 9th Congressional District or not. Please help us defeat the effort to steal North Carolina's congressional seat by contributing to the GRNC Political Victory Fund at grnc.org and clicking at the top of the page going to GRNC PVF. Again, that's grnc.org, and at the top of the page, GRNC PVF. We must defend Mark Harris for Congress. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. After our break, we will return with details from Attorney John Pierce on how your gun might subject you to felony prosecution. My name is Paul Felon, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Although no new gun control has passed in Congress in recent years, that doesn't mean there are no new restrictions on your right to keep and bear arms. Earlier this year, after the Las Vegas shootings, the Trump administration announced plans to regulate slide fire or bump fire mechanisms, commonly known as bump stocks, which provide mechanical assistance to provide rapid pull of triggers and thereby simulate fully automatic fire. Now CNN and other news outlets are announcing a pending ban on such mechanisms, done via a reinterpretation of regulations on what constitutes a fully automatic weapon, and including a requirement that owners either render them inoperable or turn them in within 90 days. Now, on the upside, recent years have also seen shifts in position by the BATFE to reduce restrictions, including issuing yet a third letter, which allows, most recently, an AR-15 type pistol with a stabilizing brace to be fired from the shoulder, potentially circumventing restrictions under the 1934 National Firearms Act on short-barreled rifles. Similarly, the ATF has approved sale of the Mossberg Shockwave and similar shotguns by defining them not as shotguns, but as firearms for the purpose of the National Firearms Act, or NFA, opening the door to common purchase of what were once tightly regulated under the NFA as short-barreled shotguns. But easing these restrictions has created a regulatory compliance minefield in which similar appearing firearms may be subject to dramatically different regulations. Regulations which recently placed an Ohio man on the receiving end of felony prosecution for allegedly, and of course illegally, creating an unregistered short-barreled rifle. And in truth, the Ohio man is not unique, and may be one of thousands of gun owners who've become inadvertent felons simply for the minor addition of things like shoulder butt pads or vertical foregrips. Now, today we are going to talk about how you can avoid being an accidental felon. And our guest for the topic is Attorney John Pierce of Virginia, whose site at John Pierce ESQ, as in Esquire, johnpierceesq.com, gives advice on how to avoid the BATFE pitfalls. When I ran across John's site, it dawned on me that we might know each other from about 10 years ago when I was writing gun rights for Examiner.com, and John was associated and was one of the co-leaders of an organization called opencarry.org. I was delighted to find that you, John, are the same John Pierce. And so welcome to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, John.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be on the show today.
So, what is your read on the bump stock ban reportedly coming down the pipe from BATFE?
Well, you know, the interesting thing, I guess, just to get us started here, is even members of Congress don't really seem to understand how the administrative and regulatory world works. You know, the way that you described it, Paul, was absolutely perfect in that the way they're attempting to do this is by reinterpreting an existing regulation that is out there, and that regulation itself is in fact based upon a statute, one of the statutes that is part of the National Firearms Act passed in 1934, and then as amended as we came down through the decades. And just a quick 30-second summary for your listeners as to how things like this actually work. Administrative agencies of the government cannot simply pass regulations on their own willy-nilly without any authorization. What happens is that Congress will pass a statute, which we will either call it the enabling statute or the organic statute. In this case, that's the NFA, and that statute might say, machine guns have to be registered, and you pay a transfer tax, etc. And then the regulations are in fact promulgated by the administrative agency that's in charge of enforcing those laws. And therefore, that's why the only way the Trump administration could do this was by having the ATF reinterpret the definition of a machine gun.
There we go. And the NFA, of course, for our listeners, essentially passed in 1934, regulates machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, sound suppressors or silencers, destructive devices, and also a category they call any other weapon. I think that's pretty much it, is it not, John?
It is. That pretty much sums it up.
Okay, so these are not machine guns we're talking about. They require one depression of the trigger for each shot fired. How does the ATF justify using NFA to restrict them exactly?
Well, you have to remember that the ATF has at times came out with some fairly absurd-sounding rulings from the Firearms Technology Branch, which is the department that is in charge of making these kind of determinations based upon some specific modifications that people have either submitted for testing or have tried and have been prosecuted for, leading to one absurd ruling that a shoestring was in fact a machine gun. It all goes back to the definition. Absolutely. It all goes back to the definition of what a machine gun is, which is a firearm capable of firing more than one round with a single pull of the trigger, or any device that renders a firearm capable of firing more than one round with a single pull of the trigger. And so for people to understand why the bump fire stocks have historically not been included in this, including after a review by the Obama administration, it's because a bump fire trigger uses the recoil of the firearm and the muscle energy of the person firing the firearm to rapidly have the trigger repressed by the shooter's finger as they're shooting, but it is not a single pull of the trigger causing multiple rounds to be fired. And what the ATF has done is basically reinterpret the phrase single pull of the trigger, meaning that now when you pull the trigger the first time and the bump action begins, it is a cyclical action, if you will, that even though you continue to pull the trigger for subsequent rounds, that it now somehow magically falls under that definition.
Basically what they're saying is, oh, never mind. Yeah, got it. Now, let me ask you another question, too. In presuming this regulation actually comes down the pipe, as claimed, it gives people 90 days to either render them inoperable or to turn them in. How do you feel about the constitutionality of that? I mean, it says that the news accounts say there may be legal challenges. I see a problem under the Fifth Amendment. What do you see?
Well, and I think so. I mean, this is very clearly a taking. If you have a piece of property that you have acquired by reliance upon previous ATF determinations that they do in fact fall outside the purview of the NFA and are therefore legal, people have acquired them, they've spent money on them, they have value, and now you have to either render them inoperative or turn them in. with no grandfathering, that clearly is a taking, and I think there are significant Fifth Amendment issues there, and I suspect that will be the basis of some, but not all, of the challenges to any such regulation.
Yeah, interesting. Now, in terms of penalties, I guess this would reclassify the bump fire stock as a machine gun, would it not? And which would mean that violation of having an unregistered machine gun is a 10-year federal felony. Would that be correct?
That is correct. It is categorizing a bump fire as a machine gun, and so just like possessing a lower receiver that has the appropriate drilling done for the machine gun positioning, or an auto sear will subject you to the penalty, the same penalty as if you had a fully functioning machine gun. The same would be true here, and it would have significant legal implications for someone who was found to have one that wasn't registered under the NFA. And by the way, under the terms of the National Firearms Act, machine guns possession is limited to those that were in existence in May of 1996 or 1986. Yeah. And since pretty much all these bump fires were manufactured after that point, you're not looking at the ability to register those. Therefore, getting them under the purview of the NFA is not possible.
Got it. All right. Well, we're going to have to take a short break. When we return, we'll be asking John how you can stay in compliance with the law if you happen to have an AR-15 pistol or not. We've got some other questions coming up. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After our break, we will give you still more critical information enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Felon, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. A few years ago, SIG Arms and SB Tactical came up with a cool idea, which was billed as a means for allowing our returning wounded warriors to better operate AR-15 style pistols. It was a pistol stabilizing brace which mounts onto the buffer tube of an AR-15 pistol or similar semi-automatic pistol and is used by inserting the forearm through it, locking it to the forearm for better unsupported fire of what is otherwise a heavy handgun. But the stabilizing brace bore a remarkable resemblance to a shoulder stock, which quickly led people to start using it as such. This caused a potential problem because firearms with a shoulder stock and a barrel of less than 16 inches are considered under the National Firearms Act to be short-barreled rifles, subject to strict regulation, including fingerprints, background check, $200 tax stamp for each transfer, and, of course, registration by the BATFE. John, picking up kind of where we were, why don't you tell us what has happened in general with respect to the ATF and these pistol stabilizing braces, kind of the short and dirty version?
Sure. Well, originally when the stabilizing brace came out, let's just look very quickly at the history of these. You had originally the ATF took the position that these were not shoulder stocks, that they were accessories that were designed in order to allow, as you said, the firearm to be the handgun to be more comfortably fired with a single hand, and that they were not designed or intended to allow someone to comfortably shoulder them. Then what happened is at the end of I believe it was 2000, at the end of 2014, Black Aces Tactical received a letter back from the ATF about a shotgun that they had, which had a arm brace attached to it. And while that item was approved by the ATF, they put some language in there that caused many of us in the legal community to be concerned that they were about to reverse their position. Sure enough, on January 16th of 2015, the ATF came out with an open letter to the firearms community about stabilizer braces. And effectively what they said was that if you had a stabilizing brace on an AR pistol and you shouldered it, even once, even incidentally, that was effectively redesigning or remanufacturing the firearm to be fired from the shoulder, and that you were therefore building an SBR in the moment that you shouldered it.
So hang on here. Using it in a different fashion redesigns a firearm. I say that's akin to having telling me that if I decide to use my hairbrush to brush my teeth, it's now a toothbrush.
That is effectively it, and so, but it very much put a damper on the arm brace industry, because even though these items are in fact designed to be used as arm braces, everyone was afraid that if they were to incidentally shoulder it and be seen doing so, that they could be charged with illegal possession of an unregistered short-barreled rifle, and it really harmed the industry. In that same open letter, by the way, the ATF touched on some other things that would also be deemed to cause the items to be considered a remanufacturing, removing the arm strap so that it could not be strapped onto the arm, permanently affixing the brace to the end of the buffer tube at a length that would not allow it to be used as an arm brace, and we're going to talk more about that length a little bit later, and doing anything else that would undermine its ability to be actually used as an arm brace. But at the time that we had that open letter, from that moment on until March of 2017, effectively the ATF had, through nothing more than the release of an open letter, reverse legality of these arm braces if you even accidentally touched it to your shoulder.
So, all right, so they've reversed themselves again, right? What now?
That is correct. They came out with a new letter on March 21st of 2017, and they basically said, with respect to stabilizing braces, ATF has concluded that attaching the brace to a handgun as a forearm brace does not make a short-barreled firearm because it is not intended to be and cannot comfortably be fired from the shoulder. And again, that comfortably be is going to come into play when we talk about that case here in a minute. And it goes on to say, to the extent that the January 2015 letter implied otherwise, that it's being overturned by the 2017 letter.
So the bottom line is, although it's not intended to be used this way, if one incidentally puts it to one's shoulder, he has not redesigned a firearm and he's not guilty of creating a short-barreled rifle, correct?
That is correct. And the exact words in the 2017 letter that people need to look at is incidental, sporadic, or situational use of an arm brace in its original approved configuration does not make it a short-barreled rifle.
In its original approved configuration. Well, so basically what that means right off the bat is don't modify the stabilizing brace in any way, shape, or form. Would that be a fair statement?
100%. That is a fair statement. If the strap that allows it to be strapped to your arm is missing and therefore it could not function, it should not be on your firearm.
Right, got it. Tell us about, what is it, Ohio versus Wright?
This was a case where a man had a stabilizing brace on an AR pistol, and as you mentioned, he had modified it a number of ways. But the thing that ultimately was part of the prosecution that he went through was that the length of pull on the firearm was supposedly greater than 13.5 inches. And
13.5 inches. What does that mean, 13.5? We haven't talked about 13.5 inches. Where does that come from?
Exactly. None of these letters directly talk about that number. The only place we see the 13.5 inches is in some certain letters that the ATF has sent to specific manufacturers in talking about the approval of their products. None of the letters to the public or notices to the public have ever mentioned this number. In those letters to manufacturers, what the ATF has noted is that the Firearms Technology Branch has found that the length of pull, and that is the distance measured horizontally, and that's important, measured horizontally from the center of the trigger to the rearmost portion of the firearm, for a rifle with a buttstock is traditionally 13.5 to 14.5 inches, and that a arm brace located on an AR pistol to be able to comfortably fit on most people's arms is going to be at a length shorter than that. And so in USV Wright, they said that because his was supposedly located at a point greater than 13.5 inches, that it indicated that he had placed it there as a shoulder stock rather than as an arm brace.
Wow. It would have been nice if they told him that before he modified the guy, actually before he put a pistol stabilizing brace on it. But that, of course, is the ATF. And what's more, didn't they actually measure it diagonally instead of measuring it horizontally?
They did. If you go online, there's a number of websites that have the pictures that were used demonstrating why measuring it vertically or diagonally rather than horizontally can cause it to appear to be greater than 13.5 when in fact it is less. And that was part of the reason that his conviction was overturned on appeal. The other thing that was very troubling about this prosecution was the fact that as part of the motions in limine that they made as part of the trial was they were trying to get the judge to exclude some of these ruling letters from consideration by the jury, and these very letters that, in fact, Mr. Wright had depended upon in making the changes that he did to his AR pistol and designing the configuration. And again, if we have these kind of regulatory rulings and interpretive findings that we're basing our decision-making on, you can't then ask the person not be able to present that as evidence in their own defense when they're accused of violating them.
You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with more critical information on how you, as a gun owner, can avoid becoming an accidental felon. My name is Paul Vallona, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. We're with John Pierce, attorney from Virginia, who has an excellent website, johnpierceesq.com, on how you can avoid becoming an accidental felon with some of the intricacies of AR-15 type pistols and regulatory compliance. Now, John, one of the things that you bring up is the addition of vertical foregrips, which are commonly used on AR-15s, but which may put you at variance with the law if you put one on a pistol. Why? How does that work?
The ATF has ruled that if you have an AR pistol, and let's assume we have a vanilla AR pistol in front of us, it does not have a stabilizer brace, it is just right out of the box, perfectly legal. You put a vertical foregrip on the front of that AR pistol, and unless the overall length of the pistol is greater than 26 inches, the addition of a vertical foregrip puts it into the category of AOW. As you noted, that stands for any other weapon under the NFA, subject to regulation. You can, however, put a vertical foregrip on an AR pistol if the AR pistol's overall length is greater than 26 inches.
Okay, so 26 inches, is that with a pistol stabilizing brace extended or collapsed, or in what position?
Whenever we're measuring overall length of a firearm, the ATF's position is, and I quote, from the extreme ends. And they have interpreted that to mean that if it has a collapsible buttstock or a collapsible arm brace, etc., on it, that it is with it fully extended.
Fully extended, okay. All right, so basically, if you put a vertical foregrip on a firearm of less than 26 inches, you have created what they call an any other weapon, right? Is that correct?
And not a firearm, a handgun.
I'm sorry, yes,
pistol.
Specifically. Okay, fair enough. Yes, a pistol. Okay.
Correct.
So that creates an any other weapon, but I saw pictures with about 4 different configurations, some of which complied, some of which didn't. For example, Magpul makes a diagonal foregrip. Is that a vertical foregrip?
It is not. There are a number of things that are not a vertical foregrip, according to the ATF. As you said, there are any number of angled foregrips that you can get, and an angled foregrip does not render an AR pistol into an AOW. The same is true, by the way, if you're familiar with what is known as a finger stop or a hand stop. Mm-hmm. That goes at the end of your handguard to ensure that you don't accidentally slip your forward hand in front of the muzzle. Those are, in fact, usually a piece of metal that does, in fact, come down vertically, albeit a very small distance. Those have been ruled not to be a vertical foregrip, even though they are vertical to the handguard, because they're not large enough for you to grip with your entire hand.
Okay.
Even complicating matters even further, there are certain bipods that can be placed on a pistol that have a sufficiently large plastic seat above the extending legs that comes down vertically. Mm-hmm. that could be interpreted as being a vertical foregrip. So I have always advised my clients to not place those on an AR-15 pistol unless the overall length is greater than 26 inches. If you find yourself wanting a vertical foregrip on an AR pistol very badly and your overall length does not exceed 26 inches, one way that a lot of my clients have gotten around this is simply having a flash hider pinned and welded to the end of their barrel, therefore making their overall length greater than 26 inches, and then you can do whatever you wish. The ATF does require for it to count, however, that it not be a removable flash extender, but one that is pinned and welded.
So that 26 inches, when measured, is from the barrel minus the flash suppressor, unless the flash suppressor is pinned and welded. Is that correct?
Correct. It has to be permanently affixed, and again, the ATF has repeatedly held that pinned and welded. And let me rephrase that. Pinned and welded is not the only way that you can have one permanently affixed. However, it is the most common way, and they have repeatedly held that pinned and welded does satisfy it.
Wow. Just amazing. I'm sure there are thousands of people probably running around with guns that are not in compliance, potentially subjecting themselves to federal prosecution for a 10-year felony. Now, here's an interesting. You're not familiar with North Carolina laws necessarily. I know you're not. You don't practice in North Carolina, but many people have asked me, well, why don't you just register it as a short-barreled rifle, as an SBR? I mean, it's not that big a deal. You can do it. But personally, I made the decision not to register my gun as an SBR because there's so much more that I can do with it when it's a pistol rather than a rifle. For example, we have a concealed handgun permit system. It is not a concealed rifle permit system. Therefore, for as long as my AR-15 pistol is a pistol, I can carry it concealed in a bag or whatever. And if it were a short-barreled rifle, I would not be able to do that. Ditto, if I'm even traversing educational property, and we have many streets in Charlotte, and for example, the the NC State campus, Hillsborough Street runs right through the NC State campus. So if you have a firearm in your car, if you're not a concealed handgun permit holder and you don't have, and the gun is not a handgun in a closed compartment within your locked motor vehicle, you're a felon. Class I felony, to be exact. So if I had this as a short-barreled rifle, I could not do that legally. I'd be a felon if I traversed educational property. As a pistol in a closed compartment in a locked motor vehicle, it's perfectly legal. Ditto for assemblies of people for which admission is charged, restaurants, parades, and funerals. I mean, people really have to think about what they're going to do with a firearm and how to treat it, because this is a very, very complex issue with very big penalties. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And as you noted, I'm licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth of Virginia and not in North Carolina, but we too have a concealed handgun permit, which does not give us any privileges regarding long guns. And therefore, we would have the exact same issues. The places that we can carry concealed, an AR-15 pistol would not, in fact, extend if it becomes something other than a handgun, namely an AOW or an SBR.
Got it. Now, we're running a little shorter on time because that was a pretty complex issue, but we started selling about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Mossberg started selling a new firearm called the Shockwave. Here in North Carolina, they were selling like hotcakes, but whispering at the edges said, well, they might be legal under federal law, but here they're weapons of mass death and destruction and therefore banned. Well, we eventually a sheriff called, asked the same question of the Attorney General, and the Attorney General issued an opinion letter which said basically they are weapons of mass death and destruction, but they're legal due to GS 14288.8B5, which I said, gee, that looks familiar. Why does that sound familiar to me? I realized it was familiar because my organization wrote it. We actually had introduced it in 2011 to resolve conflicting statutes on machine guns, and the Attorney General cited that as the rationale for making the Shockwave legal in North Carolina. So I like to say we made the gun legal in North Carolina. But that said, the Shockwave, too, has its share of potential legality problems. I've seen a pistol grip and pistol stabilizing brace sold for these things. I mean, what can I do to a Shockwave and not be a felon?
Well, let's first talk about what a Shockwave is, because the first thing that everyone needs to understand is a Shockwave is not a shotgun. It fires shotgun shells, but it is not a shotgun legally, and that's the reason that it is able to exist in the configuration that it exists in. Under the National Firearms Act, a shotgun is a firearm that is made, that's the key word, to be fired from the shoulder. Well, on the Mossberg Shockwave, it is made at the factory with a bird's head grip on it, which is not designed to be fired from the shoulder. So therefore, it's not a shotgun. It is categorized as what we call a pistol grip only, or PGO, firearm. And those type of, and because of that, then we start looking at the length of the barrel and say, well, it's not going to be a short barrel shotgun because it's not a shotgun. Is it going to be an AOW? And the way that Mossberg got around that is they made the overall length greater than 26 inches. So from the end of the muzzle to the end of the grip, it's 26.37 inches. And therefore, it is not an NFA firearm. It is not a shotgun. It's not a rifle. It's not a handgun. It is a firearm, period.
Firearm, yeah. Unfortunately, folks, we are out of time. For advice on gun issues in Virginia or under federal law, check out johnpierceesq.com. That's johnpierceesq.com. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. See you next Sunday at 5.